The emperor who refused death Rome in the year 65 AD was a whole city that believed it had seen every kind of excess, every kind of cruelty, and every kind of madness that power could produce. Yet even Rome was not prepared for what happened inside the private chambers of Emperor Nero on the night the Empress Poppaea Sabina died. She was young, admired, and pregnant, and the palace was quiet in the way it often is before disaster, with servants moving softly and guards standing like statues outside marble doors. What happened inside those rooms was never recorded in a single, clean version, because those who heard the sounds understood that some truths are too dangerous to write clearly. Some said Nero struck her in a sudden rage. Others said the beating went on far longer, but all accounts agree on one thing. When it ended, Poppaea was dying on the cold floor, and the most powerful man in the world was screaming for a miracle that would not come. Even an emperor cannot command time to turn backward. Physicians were summoned, herbs were burned, prayers were spoken, and promises were made to every god Rome still pretended to respect. But by morning, Poppaea was gone. Something else was gone with her. Those who saw Nero in the following hours said his face did not look like the face of a grieving husband, but like the face of a man who had discovered that reality itself had betrayed him. He did not weep in public. He did not speak. He simply stared at the body as if waiting for it to correct its mistake. When the servants prepared the funeral rites, Nero stopped them. He would not allow her to be taken away, and he would not allow her to be reduced to ash like an ordinary mortal. Instead, he ordered Poppaea's body preserved with impossible quantities of spices and oils, more than some provinces could produce in a year. He had her dressed in her finest gowns and placed inside a crystal sarcophagus so that he could see her whenever he wished. The court obeyed because the court always obeyed. Soon, the dead empress had a place set for her at banquets. Servants were ordered to keep her chambers exactly as they had been, down to the smallest object. At night, Nero spoke to the silent figure and waited for answers that never came. He slept only with heavy wine and drugs, and even then he woke shouting her name. The court told itself this was only grief, and that grief would pass, but what followed was not healing. It was searching. Nero began to see Poppaea's face everywhere, in the profile of a noble woman, in the eyes of a slave girl, in the curve of a stranger's mouth. When the resemblance failed, he would turn away in anger or collapse in shaking disappointment. Painters were ordered to make new portraits, again and again, and when they failed to capture what he wanted, some were punished and some were simply dismissed. Rome began to understand that the emperor was no longer looking for comfort. He was looking for replacement. 2 months after Poppaea's death, during a dull session of court business, a teenage freedman was brought forward for routine confirmation. He was young, quiet, and nervous, and his name was Sporus. Nero looked up, and the room seemed to freeze. The boy had the same eyes, the same delicate shape of face, the same strange light in his gaze that Poppaea had once had. The emperor stood, walked slowly toward him, and studied him as if studying a reflection in broken glass. In that moment, something inside Nero did not break. It decided. And in that same moment, without anyone saying it aloud, the life of Sporus ended, and something far more terrible began. The boy who looked like a ghost. From the moment Nero's eyes settled on Sporus, the court understood that something irreversible had begun, even if no one yet dared to name it. The boy stood in silence while the emperor walked around him slowly, studying him from every angle with the careful attention of a man examining a rare object. This was not the look of desire, and not even the look of simple memory. It was the look of recognition mixed with possession. Nero lifted Sporus' shin with 2 fingers and turned his face toward the light of the oil lamps, watching how the shadows moved across his cheeks, how his eyes reflected the flame in the same strange way Poppaea's once had. The officials in the room held their breath because they could all see it too, and seeing it meant understanding that the boy's fate no longer belonged to him. Sporus was barely 15, born into the imperial household, the child of a foreign captive who had died giving birth to him. He had been educated for quiet clerical work, trained to read, to write, and to disappear into the background of great men's lives. He had never been important, and that was why he was still alive. Now that changed in a single heartbeat. Nero asked his name, and when the boy answered, the emperor repeated it softly, as if testing whether the sound belonged to the face. Then he dismissed the court and ordered Sporus to remain. No explanation was given, and none was needed. In Rome, when the emperor decided something, the world simply moved to make it true. Sporus was not taken to a cell. That would have been too honest. Instead, he was led to a suite of rooms near the emperor's own chambers, filled with soft beds, rich curtains, and food he had never tasted before. The comfort was confusing, and that confusion was part of the trap. Artists arrived first, the same ones who had once painted Poppaea from life. They sketched Sporus again and again, in daylight and in shadow, from the front, from the side, from every angle that could be turned into memory. Physicians followed, measuring his bones, his shoulders, his jaw, his hips, murmuring to each other and writing things down that Sporus was not allowed to read. Nero was always there, watching, correcting, comparing every detail to images of the dead empress, circling differences as if they were mistakes that could be fixed. Very quickly, rules appeared. Sporus was told not to use his own name. Servants were instructed to call him my lady, and they did so with the careful emptiness of people who want to survive. His simple tunics were taken away and replaced with long flowing garments and colors Poppaea had loved. Each morning, servants covered his face with powders and pigments, not to decorate him, but to change him, to push his features toward something else. Nero corrected the way he stood, the way he walked, the way he held his hands, and sometimes he would stop him in the middle of a movement and simply stare, as if trying to remember where the boy ended and the dead woman began. Voice training came next. For hours each day, Sporus was made to repeat simple phrases until his throat ached and his head felt empty. Tutors softened his speech, raised it, reshaped it, and Nero listened like a craftsman judging a tool. Slowly, Sporus stopped speaking unless he was spoken to. He ate only when told. He moved through the palace like someone who is already half gone. By then, he understood what was happening, even if he could not say it. This was not a disguise. This was not a role. This was the beginning of erasure. And while Rome continued its daily life outside the palace walls, inside those golden rooms, an emperor was preparing to do something that no law, no god, and no memory would be able to undo. The palace where names were erased, by the time the seasons began to change, Sporus no longer knew. How many days had passed since he had last been allowed to be simply himself, because time inside the palace had become something soft and meaningless, measured not by sunrise and sunset, but by lessons, fittings, and the constant sound of Nero's voice correcting him. The luxury of his rooms had turned into another kind of cage, one made of silk and gold instead of iron. Servants came and went without meeting his eyes, bringing clothes, cosmetics, and instructions, and each of them understood that the boy they were serving was no longer supposed to exist as a boy at all. His name was almost never spoken now, and when it was, it sounded like a mistake. Nero treated the process like a sacred project. He compared Sporus to old portraits of Poppaea, as if they were holy images, studying tiny details that no one else would have noticed. A fraction too much width in the shoulders, a line in the jaw that needed to be softened, hands that moved with the wrong kind of confidence. None of these were flaws in a human being, but they were unforgivable in a copy. Artists were ordered to design new gowns that could hide what could not yet be changed, and tailors worked in silence, understanding that their work was not meant to dress a person, but to reshape an idea. Even the way Sporus slept was corrected, his posture adjusted so that he would wake and rise in a way that felt more familiar to the emperor as memory. The lessons never truly ended. Tutors trained him to walk more slowly, to sit with a different balance, to lower his eyes at the right moments, and lift them in the right way. Nero watched all of it, sometimes with intense focus, sometimes with visible disappointment, and that disappointment was more frightening than anger. When Sporus failed, he was not punished in the way slaves usually were. He was simply made to repeat everything again and again until exhaustion took away the part of him that wanted to resist. Little by little, he stopped trying. It was easier to obey than to remember who he had been. At night, the palace was quiet, but Sporus could hear sounds through the walls, the echo of banquets, the distant music, and sometimes Nero's voice speaking to the crystal sarcophagus that held Poppaea's body. On those nights, Sporus understood that he was not being shaped into something new, but into something that was already supposed to be dead. He was being trained to replace a ghost, and no one ever wins against a ghost, because a memory can always be more perfect than a living person. The first time Sporus was brought before the court dressed fully in the style of the empress, the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than shouting. Some people looked away. Some stared too long. No one spoke. Nero stood beside him, studying the reaction, and for a moment there was something like satisfaction on his face, followed quickly by irritation. It was close, but not close enough. That was when the emperor finally said aloud what had been waiting in his mind for months. Words were spoken quietly to the physicians, orders given without emotion, and everyone who heard them understood that the last line had been crossed. From that day on, the preparations changed. Measurements became more detailed. Discussions between doctors became longer and more secretive. Certain instruments began to appear in locked rooms. Sporus was no longer just being trained. He was being prepared. He did not know exactly what would be done to him, but he knew it would not be something that could be taken back. And as he stood one evening before a mirror and barely recognized the face looking back at him, he realized that soon even that small, fragile reflection of himself would be gone forever. The surgery that history tried to forget, when the physicians were finally summoned in full, it was not done in secret, but in the quiet, terrifying way only an emperor can manage, where orders are spoken calmly and the entire world rearranges itself to obey. These were not ordinary healers. They were the finest medical minds in Rome and beyond, men who had treated senators, generals, and members of the imperial family, and who understood very well that refusal was not an option that truly existed. Nero did not speak to them as a madman. He spoke to them as a patron, as a ruler describing a project that had been planned for a long time. He explained what he wanted in the same tone he might use to discuss the building of a new palace or the carving of a statue. Sporus was not mentioned as a person. He was mentioned as material. Before anything was done, the boy was examined again and again. His body was measured, his proportions compared to preserved records of Poppaea, and every small difference was written down. The physicians argued in low voices about what could be changed and what could only be hidden. Nero listened, and where they hesitated, he decided. If something could not be changed, it would be disguised. If it could be changed, it would be. There was no room in his plan for the word impossible. The preparations lasted weeks, and during that time Sporus lived in a state of quiet terror, treated gently, spoken to politely, and guarded at all times, like a valuable object that must not be damaged before it is finished. When the day finally came, it did not feel dramatic. There were no crowds, no speeches, no visible anger. There was only a small, carefully prepared room, clean and bright, and the smell of herbs meant to dull pain and cloud the mind. Sporus was told it was for his own good, that the emperor wished to make him perfect, that he should be grateful. He did not answer. By then, he had learned that words did not belong to him anymore. The physicians did what they had been ordered to do, step by step, following plans that had been drawn in wax and corrected by Nero himself. Some things were changed. Some things were removed. Some things were altered in ways that could never be reversed. When it was over, Sporus did not know how much time had passed, only that he woke to a body that felt both familiar and completely foreign. Recovery was slow and carefully controlled. Mirrors were kept away at first. Servants fed him, cleaned him, and helped him move, and they did so with the same careful distance one uses with something fragile and dangerous. Nero visited often, watching silently, sometimes pleased, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes clearly dissatisfied. Adjustments were discussed. Future procedures were mentioned as if they were simple improvements. Sporus listened and felt something inside him grow very quiet, because by now he understood that this was not a single event. This was a process, and it would continue for as long as Nero's memory demanded it. When he was finally allowed to see his reflection, the shock did not come as a scream or tears. It came as a deep, empty feeling. The face in the polished surface was no longer fully his, but it was not truly hers either. It was something in between, something made by command rather than by nature. Nero studied him in the mirror from behind and said only that it was getting closer. That word closer was both a promise and a threat. The palace began to treat Sporus differently after that. He was no longer just a project in progress. He was presented more often, shown to selected members of the court, always carefully, always with Nero nearby. Some people were confused, some were disturbed. No one laughed. Everyone understood that they were watching something that should not exist. And Sporus understood something else as well, something that frightened him more than pain ever had. Whatever part of him had once hoped this might end was now gone. He was no longer being prepared to become someone. He was already being used as someone else. The wedding that should never have existed by the time Nero announced his decision to marry. The palace had already been living inside a lie for so long that the lie itself had begun to feel like a second reality. The declaration did not come with celebration or explanation. It came as a simple command, delivered to the court in the same calm tone Nero used for all things that could not be questioned. There would be a wedding. The bride would be presented soon. No one was invited to discuss whether such a thing made sense, because in Rome, when the emperor's will is clear, meaning becomes irrelevant. The preparations were enormous. Tailors, jewelers, and servants worked day and night to recreate every detail of Poppaea's former splendor. Old gowns were copied. Old jewelry was brought out of sealed chambers. Even the music was chosen to match what had once been played at the empress's own ceremonies. It was not enough for Nero to perform a marriage. He wanted to perform a resurrection. And at the center of it all was Sporus, who was no longer introduced by any name at all, only by titles and gestures that belonged to a woman who had died. He was trained endlessly for the role he had no choice but to play. Every movement was rehearsed. Every expression was corrected. He was taught how to stand beside the emperor, how to lower his eyes, how to smile at the right moments. The court spoke to him as if he were fragile, but what they were really afraid of was not breaking him. They were afraid of reminding themselves of what he actually was. Some avoided looking at him. Some stared too long. No one spoke honestly. When the day came, Rome witnessed something it did not know how to name. The ceremony was magnificent, filled with light, music, and the careful display of imperial power. To the crowds, it looked like another strange act of Nero's rule, another proof that the emperor lived by his own laws. To those inside the palace, it felt like standing inside a dream that had gone wrong. Nero looked at Sporus with an intensity that was almost peaceful, as if for a moment he truly believed that what he had lost had been given back to him. Sporus stood beside him in silence, dressed in layers of silk and gold, weighed down by jewelry and expectation. He moved as he had been taught. He spoke the words he had been trained to say. Inside, there was nothing left but a distant, quiet fear, because he understood now that this was not a performance that would end with applause. This was his new position in the world, not as himself, not even as a person, but as a living replacement for a dead memory. After the ceremony, the palace treated him exactly as it had treated Poppaea. He was given her rooms, her servants, her place at banquets. Nero consulted him on matters of taste and appearance, sometimes even on matters of state, and seemed genuinely satisfied when the answers matched what he remembered. When they did not, Nero would grow distant and cold, and Sporus would be trained again until he learned to answer correctly. Rome learned to accept the impossible because Rome had always survived by accepting what it could not change. But inside the palace, something was slowly becoming unstable. Nero's moods shifted more often. His need for perfection grew sharper, and Sporus began to understand that he was not living inside a finished role, but inside an experiment that could always be declared a failure. The wedding had not ended his transformation. It had only locked him into it. And somewhere beyond the walls of the palace, forces were already moving that would soon decide what happens to creations that exist only because one man's madness insists they must. The arena, and the last choice, the world that had been built around Nero, did not survive him, because no world built on one man's obsession ever truly can. When rebellion finally reached Rome, and the Senate turned against the emperor, the palace that had once been a stage for impossible fantasies became a place of panic and whispers. Nero fled, and not long after, he died alone, abandoned by nearly everyone who had once called him a god. For the empire, his death was the end of a nightmare. For Sporus, it was only the beginning of another. The new rulers did not see him as a person who had suffered. They saw him as a symbol of everything shameful and ridiculous about the old regime, a living reminder of an emperor's madness that needed to be erased in the most public way possible. He was taken from the palace that had been his prison and his stage and handed over like a strange and unwanted object. His titles were stripped away, but his body, his voice, and his appearance could not be returned to what they had once been. There was no place in Rome for someone like him, because he no longer truly belonged to any category the world understood. The final plan was as cruel as it was theatrical. He was to be used in a public spectacle in the arena, part of a staged myth meant to mock Nero's memory and entertain the crowd at the same time. It would not be a private execution. It would be a performance, loud, humiliating, and final. When Sporus learned what was being prepared for him, something inside him did not break, because there was nothing left to break. He understood, with a strange clarity, that for his entire recent life, his body had never truly belonged to him. It had been used first to satisfy one man's grief, and now it was going to be used to satisfy another era's desire to erase the past. That was why he ran. He did not run far. There was nowhere to run to. He hid beneath an abandoned villa outside Rome, in a dark cellar that smelled of damp stone and old wine, and there he held a small glass vial of poison in his hand. For the first time in years, he was alone and not being watched. For the first time, no one was telling him how to stand, how to speak, or what he was supposed to be. The choice in front of him was simple and terrible. He could return and die as a spectacle, or he could end everything quietly, on his own terms, in the dark. History says that he chose the poison. The next morning, Rome went on with its business. Another strange chapter of the previous reign was closed, and people told themselves that the story was finished. But it was not, because what happened to Sporus was not only the story of one cruel emperor or one broken court. It was the story of what happens when power decides that a human being is not a person, but a tool, a replacement, a thing that can be reshaped and discarded. Nero believed he could defeat death by command. The world that followed proved something far colder. You can erase a name. You can change a body. You can even force someone to live as a memory. But in the end, all such creations are destroyed, and the cost is always paid by the ones who are never allowed to choose who they were.